conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, May 4th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, David Allen, author of Every Citizen a Statesman, The Dream of a Democratic Foreign Policy in the American Century. And later in the show, Joshua Craze, writer and researcher covering Sudan and the crisis there. Also on the show, Harlan Crow paid private school tuition for a kid that Clarence Thomas was raising. Don't your friends do that?
Yeah, well, now all of a sudden you can't pay private school tuition for somebody your friend's kid's raising now?
What, kids can't go to school?
Yeah, turning that down, it's like
Guess
it's
we hate
completely
education
uncurious.
now. Okay, I guess.
Uncourteous, yeah. Don't you have manners, guys? The Fed raises interest rates for the 10th time, highest they've been in 16 years. They want labor to be disciplined. The debt ceiling deadline's closer than you think. May 16th is the Senate's last scheduled workday before the deadline. New York's medical examiner determines Jordan Neely died because of neck compression, so that's the chokehold there. Tyree Nichols' autopsy also shows what many assumed: blunt force trauma from the cop's beating, cause of death. Today marks 1 year since the murder of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh by Israeli forces. Rest in power. 4 Proud Boys convicted of seditious conspiracy this morning. Georgia cops arrest the Atlanta shooting suspect. McDonald's fined by the Labor Department for employing 10-year-olds at the Kentucky locations. Montana Governor Gianforte signs 5 bills limiting abortion in the state after signing into law a gender-affirming care ban days before over the objection of his non-binary child. North Carolina's House passes its own anti-trans and anti-abortion legislation, sending it to the new Republican veto-proof majority in the state Senate. And lastly, Brazilian police raid Bolsonaro's home over fake vaccine cards, which is hilarious. Yeah?
Wonder why you keep ending
All this
up in
and
the
more on
hospital.
today's program. What? Go on?
Wonder why you keep ending up in the hospital.
Yeah.
Sick with COVID.
All this and more on today's program. Man, Michael would have really enjoyed that story, right?
Yes, I think...
Home being raided over fake vaccine cards. I like that.
starts at the top. I mean, I think...
I wish the left in this country would treat its political opponents with the same kind of vitriol.
I honestly think if we could find out who was engaging in fake vaccine cards during the pandemic, there'd be a lot of like Bolsonaro high-ranking people, but also pretty much every police department in the United States.
Oh my God. Yeah. And I always wonder, too, how many of those were handed out to athletes. Like Antonio Brown got caught with one. But
Interesting.
But I would guess it's like higher in hockey, for example, than in basketball. Just a guess. So obviously, at this point, I'm sure people have become aware of the horrific story in New York City. The killing of Jordan Neely, a houseless black man who was killed by a subway rider, a Marine, former Marine, via chokehold. The cause of death has now shown that it was the chokehold that killed Neely in this instance. Neck compression was the cause of death. And there was a lot of outrage about this because the video is graphic and horrific, and because outlets like the New York Post were openly celebrating the murder of this unhoused man on public transit. So there were protests at the Broadway Lafayette station yesterday. I actually caught some of them because I was transferring to the 6th there. And or the people kind of leaving at that point. And Eric Adams responded to this. This is the same Eric Adams who has now cut, or he did this last year, cut services, or cut funds, I should say, to the city's Department of Homeless Services to the tune of $615 million last calendar year. So here he is responding to this story. This is his statement here. Any loss of life is tragic. There's a lot we don't know about what happened here. It's on video. So I'm going to refrain from commenting further. However, we do know that there were serious mental health issues in play here, which is why our administration has made record investments in providing care to those who need it and getting people off of the streets and the subways and out of dangerous situations. Let me just now say, blah, 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 blah. And I need all elected officials and advocacy groups to join us in prioritizing getting people the care they need and not just allowing them to languish. What he does when he's referencing getting people out of those dangerous situations is he's referring to his program of involuntary hospitalization, where police have essentially, because there have been cuts to these mental health care services and homeless services, they have been dropping them off in the ER and letting essentially medical professionals just deal with this. If homeless people are, in cops' estimation, exhibiting signs of mental health issues, they are involuntarily detained and taken to the hospital. This is not a sustainable program. What we need is housing and healthcare in this city and in this country. And he's also at the same time militarizing the police in the city and increasing the number of cops in the subways. And I mean, these incidents are still happening. So what we really need is, again, housing and healthcare services. Kathy Hochul also responded here to a question about Neely's death, the governor. Here she is. Is she looking to the side this entire time? Okay. Very, very talented politician. I say that sarcastically because she really just keeps failing upwards. This is worse than Sam's example of Michelle Bachmann looking slightly into the other camera. She's literally at a 90-degree angle. All right.
Not aware of evidence of that, and once it came to light, we parted ways.
Governor, I don't know if you saw the video of the man who was killed in a chokehold on the subway here in New York City this week. The man who put him in the chokehold was released without charges. I wanted to get your take. If you've seen the video, if you think the man who put him in the chokehold should have been released without charges. And I know it kind of gets into this broader people's question of subway safety, and if people felt unsafe, the man did not seem to be acting violent. So I just want to get your take.
No, and again, one element we have not talked about is the $1 billion investment we have in mental health services, so we don't have people who are homeless in our subways, many of them in the throes of mental health episodes, and that's what I believe are some of the factors involved here. And there's consequences for behavior, and I look at it more closely to find out whether the state has a role. People who've been out on parole have different consequences, and a judge can make a decision on whether to hold someone, or a DA can make a decision to charge. Is on parole, then the state has an ability, as we've done before in more serious cases, to ensure that someone is held during pending the outcome of the episode. But no, that was deeply disturbing, and that causes a lot of fear in people. And actually, the mayor and I are working so hard to restore that sense of safety. We have the cameras on the subways. We have more police officers. We're assisting with overtime. We've been doing so much, and the numbers have been improving. The number of crimes on subways has been declining. And I don't want people to feel anxious again when something like that comes to light. It is deeply disturbing.
Last question.
Governor, the mayor just...
So notice how, I mean, nothing about the victim. Nothing.
It's about how people are feeling in the sense of like
Feeling a little bit uneasy. I mean, we've all been there. We have all three of us in this room have been there. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Just to outline the story for people, this is from the New York Post story, the original one, which is enough details where people shouldn't be morally confused about this, but he started screaming in an aggressive manner. He said he had no food, he had no drink, he was tired, and he doesn't care if he goes to jail. He started screaming all these things, took off his jacket, a black jacket that he had, and threw it on the ground. Now, like you said, I've seen this a lot of times in New York, which is not to say it should be immune to it. It's somebody basically desperate saying, I'm being socially murdered. I'm being murdered by society right now because I am not being cared for and I'm impoverished. And like, we need to deal with that.
Yeah.
Like that thing, like, and of course, like, and instead of dealing with that sort of thing, we have this people like Hochul catering to fear, and to the point where this guy wasn't acting violent. He was yelling. And look, things happen where people do get violent out of desperation, and like that's why you don't let people get to this sort of broken, uncared for, left adrift by society condition that they're in. And like, and then when you have politicians like Hochul saying like, oh, actually the thing is we need to make sure people don't be so afraid. Well, like, no, like you have like contributed to this atmosphere of fear where a guy murders somebody who's yelling about how hungry and poor and desperate he is. And there's a few people on that camera who are like, I'm worried a little bit about his well-being. And then at one point, like there's another line from this New York Post story where he says, none of us thought he was in danger of dying. We thought he just passed out or ran out of air. And it's like, what is being run out of air? What is running out of air? Like, I can't imagine running out of air and it not being an emergency situation where I'm afraid for my life.
Well, this is, as you say, the result of a mass dehumanization campaign that politicians like Eric Adams and Kathy Hochul both fuel and feed into. And they'll never get credit for being as right-wing as they can be on homelessness or crime. And yet they still do it every time because, frankly, it's ideological for them. This is endemic with a lot of Democrats in blue states with large cities. They ride a wave of dehumanization of people who are struggling the most, as much as possible. And so she doesn't even acknowledge Neely as a human being in that statement. She says, quote, there's consequences for behavior. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
So there's consequences for having a mental health episode in the form of death.
Yeah, and
execution, public execution by a subway rider.
And you know who actually should bear some of the result of these consequences is Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams. Not only politically, because they're them contributing in not the crime wave, but the crime reporting and talking about crime
yeah
wave.
It causes a lot of fear. No, that's you're
causing the fear by continually maximizing these incidents as if they are happening constantly everywhere, and they are not. And then that seeps into people's psyche and mindsets to where a guy on the subway, this 24-year-old Marine, thinks it's incumbent upon himself to neutralize the threat, so to speak, by killing someone.
Yes.
By literally a guy saying, I'm starving, I'm thirsty, I have nowhere to go, I'd rather be in jail because I have nothing to live for, essentially.
Yeah.
I have nothing to live by. And our response as a society on that micro society in that subway car was to kill that guy and hold him down while he died.
He's exhibiting the symptoms of a sick society, and he is sick himself because of our society. And that crime, for the crime of having symptoms, he's executed. And I'll just say this really quick as well, quickly. I was hit at one point sitting on the subway by a man who was having a mental health episode. He sat next to me, and he was elbowing and kind of flailing around, and hit me in the face and in my body. And it was jarring, right? The idea that I would want him to be hurt in any way, I just didn't want to be near him in that moment because I understood something was going on here. Every one of us who's taken public transit has had this kind of situation, something similar happen, seeing someone struggling. That doesn't mean that our fear in that instance, and I was a little scared because I was hit.
It's a problem. Like, it's people that need help.
But like, my fear is not the primary object of like what we should be focusing on right now. It's the fact that this person is in pain. And so like the politics of dehumanization privileges the bourgeois kind of concern of people's like immediate discomfort in this narrow instance, as opposed to larger humanity and life. It's really freaking twisted.
Yeah, I just wanted to read a small thing from this piece by Defector's Albert Bernico. It's titled "Jordan Neely Just Needed Some Help." He ends this piece by saying, "At 30, he had no place to live. He was hungry and thirsty and tired and upset. He was experiencing a whole stack of separate crises piled onto each other. He walked into a crowded subway car carrying those crises. One of the people there decided that the problem in that situation wasn't that Jordan Neely was hungry or thirsty or tired, or that he was in obvious distress, but rather that on top of those other things, he was also breathing, and killed him. Somebody else took their phone out and recorded it. That was Jordan Neely's whole and only life. It ended when he walked into a room full of people, homeless and hungry and thirsty and tired, and they helped themselves to his silence."
There you go.
Who
said that?
That was Albert Bernico at Defector. He wrote a piece called "Jordan Neely Just Needed Some Help."
That's really well said.
This is a sore in our society, particularly, I guess. Like, you know, they made movies called Death Wish about this sort of like glorifying this sort of vigilantism, and it's still something we have to deal with today because we never really dealt with the fact that we leave a whole group of people to be ground up by how we run society.
Well, goddamn. All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by David Allen. We are back with David Allen, historian and author of Every Citizen a Statesman, The Dream of a Democratic Foreign Policy in the American Century. David, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for inviting me, Emma. Real joy to be here.
Of course. So, you know, it's funny. Your book really just touches on, I think, this inherent understanding that a lot of Americans have, whether it's from the left or like the conspiracy side of the right, where they think that the deep state is subverting Donald Trump or whatever. But there is this understanding, right, that American citizens just don't know what's happening in our national security agencies, and we don't have any control over them. And yet we live in a democracy. I mean, what made you want to explore that kind of fundamental tension? Or we're supposed to live in a democracy. Obviously, we don't.
It's true, and that's kind of where I came from. I know that you had my friend and colleague Matthew Connolly on the show a few weeks ago. Many years ago, I was working with him on his project on official secrecy, and I was getting into how the state has constructed, you know, classification in this secrecy regime, and seeing how limited the information that the public has is, and how strong the debates were in the 1940s and 1950s when that regime was imposed. And I figured that this cannot really have been how things were supposed to have turned out. This can't have been what a democratic foreign policy was supposed to look like. So then I started investigating what the alternatives were throughout the 20th century American history.
Yes. And I really, I will say I had a cynicism that your book really did undercut, about how like maybe this is just in the 21st century how foreign policy was destined to be, essentially, right? It's they're when people are in power, they're very likely to create like a secrecy to protect themselves and do these kinds of covert actions. But I mean, your historical focus like undercuts that. Talk a bit about the institutions that were starting to come into formation post World War I, and how there was really an alternative vision that ended up kind of getting superseded after World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm trying to show throughout is for the last 100 years, or at least for the first half of the 20th century, there's been a real debate about what the vision for making American foreign policy should be. And so we've ended up with this establishment, this elite, this blob, whatever you want to call it. But if you ask a lot of the people who were really prominent in the making of American foreign policy up to the 60s, they would have been horrified by this end result. They would have thought it was undemocratic. They would have called it undemocratic. They would have hated the very idea. And this, in part, was a consequence of the institutions that you mentioned. So after World War I, when the United States is starting to throw its weight around in the world a little bit more than it had, especially in Asian and European politics, you get a bunch of different institutions which exist to kind of reconcile this more extrovert foreign policy with mass democracy at home. They're all, the most important of them, the Foreign Policy Association, which is kind of a nothing group now, but was really important in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was filled with progressives, Jane Addams and other suffragists, down to real heavyweight activists and radicals even, who allied with much more conservative figures to try and learn something about foreign policy, teach themselves something so that they could change the way the United States was acting in the world, and teach their fellow citizens. At the time, a fairly elite group of fellow citizens, but fellow citizens nonetheless. So in the book, I trace how that institution and several others coming out of it, over time, differently approach the question of a democratic foreign policy, who they think should be involved, who had the right to get involved, what they ought to know, what their relationship to policymakers ought to be. It's a fairly dismal story, as you say. By the 1960s, all of this has failed. But I think it's a story worth telling, especially today.
Well, let's tell it a little bit then there. What was the context in which this organization came to be, especially in relation to Woodrow Wilson and the United States' desire to make the U.S. this major power on the world stage?
I think that if you look at the kind of infrastructure of American foreign policy at the time, the State Department was a tiny, tiny, tiny organization. It had a few hundred employees, if that. You couldn't run a kind of advanced foreign policy like Wilson was trying simply from there. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. You needed to have more people who could potentially work for the State Department and other institutions. You needed to have people for a public for them to speak to kind of root foreign policy in democracy in some way. Otherwise, the foreign policy was dangerous. You can't just make policy on the fly and not refer to a public democratically at all. And so there's a kind of general understanding that if the United States is going to get more involved in European politics, especially, Americans need to know more about the world. And they do this in a variety of different ways. I mean, they do it by researching. Foreign Policy Association is kind of the first real think tank for foreign policy. There weren't any of those at the time. There weren't even international relations departments in universities or anything like that. They do it by holding kind of public meetings, big luncheons in high society, hotels, things like that. And so there's a real sense at the time that this was a kind of collective endeavor, that American foreign policy wouldn't succeed unless it was kind of deeply rooted in at least some kind of American public, not necessarily everybody by any means, but at least some citizens out there beyond Washington.
Yes, and so I mean, that was a competing viewpoint, right? What were the opposite kind of institutions that were forming that ended up obviously being victorious?
So this is where the conspiracy theories kick in, really. This is so. On the other side, you have the State Department itself, which was never entirely certain that this was a good idea. And you have the Council on Foreign Relations, essentially, which then, as now, was a very small, limited group, invite only, all men, all rich men, white men, which believed that it essentially had the exclusive right to talk about U.S. foreign policy and impose its views on everybody else. It didn't think that, whereas the Foreign Policy Association thought there was safety in kind of public knowledge and public debate, the Council on Foreign Relations only saw the danger in that. Now, the association and a bunch of other institutions were way more powerful than the Council on Foreign Relations until World War II. When there's a kind of fairly complicated series of maneuvers that the council pulls, which gets it close to the much closer to the State Department. But for a long time, this view that foreign policy had to be restricted to a very narrow group of people was not powerful at all. It was roundly mocked. And it didn't really, even if the council became powerful in the 1940s, the idea that its views about public opinion were kind of controlling or correct was not true until the 1960s. Even as late as the 1960s, you can find secretaries of state saying, we need to root foreign policy in the American people. We need to educate the people. There needs to be kind of collective participation. It's only after that that the establishment, weirdly as a result of Vietnam, when the establishment gets criticized, weirdly it takes power after that. I mean, it's bigger than it was prior to that, but that's when the shift really, finally, irreversibly comes.
The Cold War. I mean, right? Is that too simple of an explanation?
It's not too simple of an explanation. So definitely widespread public participation in the making of American foreign policy becomes way more difficult after 1945, simply because the United States is involved in many, many more places all over the world. That's one thing. So a citizen could be expected to, policymakers hoped that thought that citizens needed to, have much more knowledge about a wider range of topics. It's also true that public participation in nuclear weapons are not necessarily a great mix. I mean, you can't have a referendum on nuclear weapon use. And so as the United States foreign policy in the 40s, 50s, and 60s starts to turn more on the nuclear issue and the relationship with the Soviet Union, there are obvious arguments for cutting the public out as much as possible, because it's, even people who believed in mass public participation in foreign policy thought that on nuclear weapons could be quite difficult, if not dangerous.
And how much of the competing and eventually victorious apparatus sees that were trying to wall off foreign policy from democracy, how much of that had to do with the beginning of the United States becoming a real empire globally in terms of wanting to extract resources from other nations, and that being a fundamental part of why, guys like the Dulleses wanted how they wanted the United States government to function and enrich themselves?
I think it's easy to see conspiracies where there's mostly just incompetence and
Gotcha.
Individual actors all over the place. A lot of it certainly, I mean, the rise of the Council on Foreign Relations in particular is directly tied to kind of planning for empire. I don't know if any of your readers have read or know Stephen Wertheim or if he's been on the show or anything.
He's been on the show a few times,
but in his book Tomorrow the World, he shows very carefully how the council is really involved in creating a blueprint for world preeminence or world domination, whatever you want to call it, in the 1940s. And then that simply gets sold to the public in 1944, 45. You either take it or you leave it. And it's very clear that the public has to take it. And once that planning happens behind closed doors, in secret, as it does in the early 1940s, that template is set. And so you see again and again in the 40s and 50s that plans for American foreign policy are hatched behind closed doors and then simply sometimes not referred to the public at all, more often than not in some respects. But when they're important and require a lot of domestic resources like the Marshall Plan or things like this, essentially the DAC is stacked. The public is given a take it or leave it option, and there's only one way in which they can really answer. So yes, approve the Marshall Plan, or you're an isolationist, et cetera, throughout American history.
And so I guess let's then turn to the World War II, where things really begin to shift, and some of the consensus really begins to get muddied, I guess, right? Because I guess, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it. Is it the FPA? The acronym? Yeah, the FPA starts to become a little bit more tied to what FDR wants to do, as you write, and he obviously ends up getting the United States involved in World War II. Talk a bit about how that fundamental change happens.
Well, they do it for what at the time seemed like good patriotic reasons, right? I mean, the culture of service and deference to power then was very different to what it would be like now. They see it as part of their duty in World War II to do what the president wants, and the president is very solicitous. He was a former member of the FPA. His wife had been on the board. They were very close. And things are still open by the end of World War II. It's not clear what a democratic foreign policy will look like. In fact, the State Department at the end in 1945 goes around telling everybody that State Department, the foreign policy of the United States is merely the expression of the will of the people, and that there's going to be this new cooperative model of foreign policy, which by 1947 is just a joke. But everything gets closer to the state. And then the state after World War II gets dramatically bigger. Much more powerful. You get the construction of the national security state, essentially as a kind of continuation of wartime state making. I mean, that's what the reason the Cold War is a Cold War in the United States is because it's patterned on the methods of World War II in terms of how you fight it, how you create a state, how you continue a state. And so the public is, it's hard once those institutions have been created, something like the National Security Council, or the Defense Department, once those institutions have been created and debate about the future of American foreign policy has been taken into those institutions rather than held in public, it's very hard to kind of overcome the inertia that sets up.
Right. I mean, and it just snowballs, essentially, right? I mean, the United States, so if the Cold War is this kind of inflection point for a lot of these anti-democratic impulses and moves, I mean, 9/11 and the war on terror puts that on steroids.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's this is why I end the book with kind of a cop out. I'm not a particularly radical guy myself. I don't have easy answers to any of this. It's hard now to come up with concrete proposals as to how the U.S. foreign policy could be like dramatically democratized, because it's just like inconceivable. I mean, what would it look like?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really can really tell, and especially the distance between what we have now and what an ideal might be is so vast that getting from A to B is really difficult. And that is, yes, a function of later history than the 60s and 70s, when it was still possible, as the anti-war radicals did, to propose alternatives and imagine a better world. Now it's much harder. In fact, there have been kind of two competing schools of reviews of my book. One of kind of optimism that something is possible, or at least in terms of ideas, and the other just completely pessimistic about the whole thing. And I think that's kind of telling. It's kind of hard to come to a consensus that something could be done.
Well, has there been any historical examples of the inclusion of democratic models in foreign policy? I know it's really difficult to map that out, especially because there's no equivalent country to the United States in this way.
Right. There's no. This is why the effort comes about after World War I, and especially and during World War II in the first place, because the United States has unfathomable power on the world stage in that period, as it still does today. But it also has a fairly well developed, although racist and contested democracy at the time. You needed to find some way to reconcile it. You couldn't just act like Great Britain. You couldn't act like the Roman Empire and keep the ruling of it to a very narrow group of people. No, there haven't been any great examples except from the United States' own past, and that's the story I tell. But I don't think the United States ever approached the ideal. There were parts in World War II, it got closer. The public definitely felt a real sense of participation in joining the United Nations, for instance. And there was a kind of participatory foreign policy around United Nations issues really into the 1950s. But that's because policymakers allowed that to happen because they didn't really think that kind of thing was that important in the Cold War. So it's an outlet for kind of activist energies.
What about the rise of think tanks, things like the Rand Corporation and other like hallowed halls, foreign policy thinkers that like that kind of cottage industry?
So in a sense, you can call that participation of a kind. Definitely think tankers think of themselves as kind of representing the public in foreign policy debate, right? And that's how they were set up. I mean, if you read Daniel Bessner's research, for instance, on Rand in the late 40s and 50s, it was explicitly set up on a very pessimistic model about public participation. The idea that we as experts have knowledge that the public does not and cannot have, and therefore we will represent the public to the government instead. So the whole kind of infrastructure was built on the idea that the public couldn't do this kind of things. So think tank experts had to do. It's not just think tanks. I mean, it was through area studies programs in universities and everything. These really crop up in the 50s. And again, just like with the national security state, once the institutions develop power, they become very, very sticky. Some of the former and unwilling to give up that power. There's a really interesting and completely unread report that came out of the Carnegie Endowment just before the 2020 election, I think, in which the current national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, writes quite eloquently about public participation and the need for more of it. But the power that he actually wants to give to the public is minuscule. We're tinkering around the edges rather than offering radical change here. So yeah, it's the same kind of thing, sticky institutions that are very hard to change.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess we have not really said the word CIA yet.
Sure.
I mean, the creation of such a powerful international intelligence agency, that's got to be a bit of the nail in the coffin, and for the idea of democratic participation in foreign policy, really, I guess, when it comes to us, at least in this country.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely, the CIA for sure by the early 1950s. The Defense Department itself, once you start running a lot of what could be called foreign policy out of a military institution, there's a long history, even among progressives, in the American story of kind of suspending is not the right word, but kind of weakening democratic impulses in a time of war. And if you define foreign policy as the United States has done since the 1940s as essentially warlike, or if you define our times as constant near war, as it was in the Cold War, then it's very hard for democratic values to kind of impinge on that. It's kind of it's a vicious circle, very, very quickly.
Absolutely. Well, David Allen, historian, author of Every Citizen a Statesman, The Dream of a Democratic Foreign Policy in the American Century. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to the book in the podcast description on our website, YouTube description as well. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks so much, Emma.
All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be joined by Joshua Craze to talk about Sudan. We are back, and we are joined now by Joshua Craze, writer and researcher covering Sudan. Joshua, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So let's start as broadly as possible here. I would guess a majority of our audience is not totally familiar with the conflict in Sudan. What's the quick history of the conflict, how we got to this point, and what are the sides that are involved here?
So this is the eagle-eyed, 2-minute view.
Right.
For 30 years, Sudan was ruled by a dictator called Omar al-Bashir. And he organized his rule, he maintained his power by setting up these opposing military blocs that each sort of competed against each other. One of them was the Sudan Armed Forces, currently represented by a man called Burhan. The other was a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, run by a man known as EmMajority. And these were two of the major forces that he used to wreak out his very violent rule in the country by taking over resources from the peripheries of the country. He fell after a revolution in 2019, after massive civilian unrest and discontent with his rule. That then led to a transitional government between civilian forces, known as the FFC, and the military. So that combined all the security sectors together. And that trundled along for a year. It made a variety of economic decisions that were very unpopular. But at the final moment, in October 2021, there was a coup and the army took over. So up to this point, the battles really between the civilians and the army. The coup, however, wasn't successful. It's important to say that neither Hemeti nor Burhan have any real political legitimacy in the country. They have no real support. And in December of 2022, so just a few months ago, under international pressure, the military junta, so Hemeti and Burhan, were pushed into a new agreement with the civilians. That might seem like a good thing, but actually it was a bad thing. And the reason it was a bad thing is that it suddenly forced these two military actors to make real concessions. And the big number one concession was, does the RSF, this paramilitary force, join the army? And so Hemeti, the head of the paramilitary force, said, yeah, sure, we'll join in 22 years' time. And the army were like, let's try 2 years. Suddenly, they had, in a month, because of the totally unrealistic time frame of this peace agreement, to reconcile these major decisions about the military future of the country. And that was when you really saw build-up. So you saw the RSF position themselves outside of air bases, which is the Sudan Armed Forces' major military advantage over them. You saw the armed forces kicking people out of meetings, and that really set the precipitating stage for the violence that we're seeing right now.
So, what was the state of the military prior to this? Because these groups are essentially privatized, right? They're paramilitary groups outside of the official channels of, say, what the military is. My sense is that the military is pretty weak and these groups have gotten quite large and powerful. But how did it get to this point?
So when Bashir was in power, he was really worried about a coup. He'd come to power in a coup, and he was really worried about another one. And he thought the main source of a coup would be the army. So for 2 decades, he systematically underfunded the army, mistreated its infantry, and in the meantime brought up these other groups, which is the RSF, Hemeti's group, to both carry out sort of army operations, but also to sort of coup-proof the regime against the army. So it's not entirely true to say the army's weak. It still has air power. It has massive backing from Egypt. It still has artillery, but in terms of its combat effectiveness, it's not as effective in general as the RSF, this other group that Bashir brought up.
And Bashir, let's zoom out and go back a little bit in history before talking about the present here, because he ruled for 20, 30 years, a few decades at that point. What was the state of the country, and what were some of the things that ended up in his toppling or that created an atmosphere that played out in the coup and ended up with his toppling in 2019?
So Bashir ruled basically by a version of sort of neoliberal austerity. So he privatized a lot of the government. He gave it to his friends in the military to basically run. So the military and the RSF both have enormous economic empires. And the way he ruled was to sort of pay off basically potential rivals. So it's this sort of transactional politics within government. And that was all running okay until 2011. And then the south of the country, what is now South Sudan, seceded. This was a huge problem for Bashir, because with South Sudan went 75% of the country's oil revenues. And that's the vast majority of their foreign exchange reserves. That meant two things. He suddenly started to struggle to pay off these commanders but he also could no longer really use subsidies. And he'd given subsidies on fuel and on wheat, which had essentially placated to some degree the urban elite. So Sudan, we have to remember, is a country where politics occurs in Khartoum, the capital, and its satellite cities. The peripheries are used for resource exploitation. They've complained since the beginning of the country in 1956 about exploitation from the center. And suddenly he could no longer strike this sort of Faustian bargain with the center, where they get an okay standard of living relatively, they get subsidized fuel, they get subsidized bread. And so he cut those subsidies. And when he cut the subsidies, protests immediately broke out around the country in 2018.
And I mean, in terms of who Hemeti and Burhan represent in factions wise, where are they in that kind of power struggle with people in the central government and in the cities versus people in the more rural areas living where there's more resources extraction?
So Hemeti, as the famous story of Hemeti goes, was a camel trader on the border between Sudan and Chad in the west of the country in Darfur. And he made his name as a militia fighter for Bashir, first in the Janjaweed, or the Evil Horsemen, and then when they became formalized as the RSF. So he's an interloper. He's a figure from outside of Khartoum. But making the matter more complicated, he's the figure who in Darfur violently repressed non-Arab groups for 10 years. So it's not like he's particularly popular in Darfur, right? It's not like he is the voice of the peripheries who's come to town. He is a voice of the peripheries in a certain way. He's hated in the center. The center can be very racist and dismissive of these figures, but it's not like he's the voice of a popular uprising. Actually, he is a militia fighter who's made a lot of money exporting his militias on the Emirati payroll to fight in Yemen and Libya and controlling the gold mining which occurs in Darfur. And that was one of the ways that Bashir tried to save his government after South Sudan's secession and the collapse of the oil revenue by going into gold. And that was really the material way in which Hemeti became the powerful man he is today.
And I mean, so for Burhan, is he just essentially a creature of the political elite in the urban centers in Sudan?
So Burhan represents the army, and the army from the beginning of Sudan is one of the two classic institutions. It's built by the Egyptian army, and it looks to Egypt. He is a functionary of the army, but the army itself is complicated because part of the army is still indebted to the old regime, so Bashir's regime, still thinks about, so Bashir was backed up by the Islamists, so still contains a big Islamist portion, and still envisage a return to some form of Bashir's government. Other parts of the army are more complicated and don't like the Islamists and actually have a lot of sympathy to the civilians. So he represents basically the army institutional authority, which is worried about a civilian transition, because a civilian transition and a civilian government would mean that the army takes a step back in government, but also might lose a lot of its economic resources. So importantly, when the coup happened, the first thing they did was dismantle the dismantling committee. And the dismantling committee was this committee set up to get rid of the old regime of Bashir. And the first thing they did was like, let's stop that. No, we don't want to dismantle the old regime. We want to take it over.
Right. Right. I mean, and that's kind of a tale as old as time. But I am curious because returning to what you were saying about Hemeti and his crushing and of non-Arabs in the country of Sudan, what is the real makeup of religious and ethnic kind of majorities and minorities that makes that dynamic kind of because I mean my sense is that Bashir also was pretty crushing for minorities in the country as well.
So Sudan's a land of literally over 100 different ethnic groups and over 100 languages. So it's a very complicated tapestry. Hemeti comes from an Arab group, the Rizagat, in Darfur, and has been fighting against non-Arab groups at the behest of Bashir for a long time. So it's been part of Bashir's repressive apparatus. And it's generally true to say that what happened in the country historically is that a very small set of elites in the center who think of themselves as Arabs around the Nile, so they're riparian elites, have dominated the rest of the country, which include a wide variety of ethnic groups. And I think what we've seen really since Bashir's fall is also a lot of those peripheries rise up even more strongly to demand devolution of power, and a greater representation in the politics of Khartoum. So there is a truth to say that part of Hemeti's rise is about the announcement that politics in Sudan cannot continue as it was. It cannot continue merely as an elite central affair that represses the periphery of the country.
Okay, so I think we've laid the groundwork pretty well, or you have, Joshua. Thank you for the present day. So where are we at right now? I mean, I know that in April fighting broke out, and there's been this tenuous ceasefire, but there was death and violence. What led to that exact moment, and where are we right now?
So it's important to say there hasn't been a tenuous ceasefire.
Oh, sorry.
There hasn't been a ceasefire. No. It's like it happens every single day that there is basically, like for the first 8 days or something, an announcement of a ceasefire. And it was like everyone had their morning cup of coffee and like, today's going to be a different day. We're going to be better human beings. And then the same thing happened. But to be
honest, Joshua, this is why it's great to have you on, because in the Western press, that's what's reported, and it's very difficult to kind of get a sense. But go ahead.
Because I think I know I'll come to the question of where we are, but this touches on something really important, which is that throughout the process since Bashir's fall, it's been the military that the West has kowtowed to. They've said, look, they're willing to do a deal. They're not Islamists. We need to include them in any process. We can trust them. And time and again, the military has shown it has no intention of any sort of security sector reform, of letting go of their economic assets. And then there was a coup, and they overthrew the civilian government. And then yet again, America said, we're not going to sanction them. That was Molly Fee's decision, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And they were again kowtowed to. And I think the real danger of this moment is we see all these ceasefire enunciations. I was joking with a friend that the only reason there are ceasefire enunciations is so that Volker Perth, the head of the UN, will stop calling them. They don't they intend to provide like a sort of an appearance that they're doing what is right. If you read the RSF's Twitter feed, that's Hemeti's group, it reads like it was written by a human rights group. But of course, that's what they're giving the internationals for consumption. That's not what's actually happening. So what is actually happening? The first move was actually made by SAF to attack the RSF, but that was largely an anticipatory move because the RSF has been surrounding a lot of the airport bases. In Khartoum itself, what was, when I was last there in September, a wonderful, vibrant city full of civil societies, music, real political discussion, is a shell. It is incredibly hard for my friends to get food, water. I was speaking to someone this morning. He put the phone up, this is another ceasefire, to the sky, and you just heard the heavy hitting of dushkas throughout the day. He lives close to Hemeti's house. There is no intention to keep a ceasefire on either side for different reasons. For the army, this is a chance to really eliminate Hemeti. Hemeti is hated because they thought that Hemeti threw Bashir under the bus. He was one of the people who organized the coup d'etat that originally got rid of Bashir. He's not liked because he's an interloper. He's not liked because he's a threat to the military's economic power base. So they're hoping that they will crush him sufficiently in Khartoum and elsewhere that when they do come to the negotiating table, he'll come in a massively weakened position and basically be forced to give up his empire. For the same reason, Hemeti sees no off-ramp here. It's hard to imagine what Hemeti's game is. Hemeti had a dream at a certain moment of, if not being the prime minister, of being an international statesman. So you could see, like, during the run-up to this agreement in December, he was trying to position himself close to the civilians, whereas the army was trying to recruit rebel organizations to his cause. But Hemeti did a number of things that have not worked well. So he went to visit Putin on the day that Ukraine was invaded. It was not a good look for him. You know, the Americans are like, just get rid of this guy, right? Like,
yeah.
Then, of course, he has involvement with Wagner, the Russian mercenaries, in gold mining. So, and Hemeti is then thought of as this, like there's a big pro-state bias in favor of SAF. Despite all the crimes SAF has committed, despite the fact that SAF has been bombing civilians in Khartoum to try to dislodge the RSF from from residential areas, there's still this pro-state bias that says, like, it's the national army. These guys are, interlopers, militia fighters, paramilitaries. You've got to get rid of them. So he's really in a position where there's no off-ramp for him. This is an existential fight. Either he wins this or he loses. But the problem is, even if he wins Khartoum, which is what is happening at the moment, RSF is still basically controlling Khartoum because their fighters are better at urban warfare. What happens then? He's not going to get any recognition. There's no way that America is going to come and go, Hemeti, you're our guy. For Egypt, he's a dead letter because they back the military, which they see as their child in a certain way. So unfortunately, the stage is really set for a quite pronounced stalemate in Khartoum. Around the rest of the country, there's been a lot of fighting in Darfur, in Al Jamena, in El Fasher, in Nyala, and that fighting is partly between RSF and SAF, but also it's been because the RSF are from certain groups in Darfur. And other groups have been reacting to them and either defending themselves against the RSF, who've been stealing everything they can, or they've been thinking this is an opportunity to attack the RSF and dislodge those Arab groups from their control in parts of Darfur. Around much of the rest of the country, though, just to finish like an overall picture, it's actually pretty peaceful. This isn't a civil war in the sense that the backing for the army is pretty minimal and the backing for the RSF is pretty minimal. It's really impacting the capital because the capital is where politics has always been done in Sudan. Unfortunately, that's created huge amounts of displaced people, an enormous amount of suffering, but it hasn't yet led to a sort of civil war around the country.
So, and is there fears that that could actually happen, though? I mean, the violence in and of itself is horrifying, but is escalation towards other areas of the country a possibility at this point, or a probability?
It's a possibility. I don't think it's a probability. Okay. I think so. For instance, there are a lot of other rebel groups in Sudan, just to make it even more complicated, and they thus far haven't taken a stance in this war publicly, and they haven't got involved. The RSF has some backing in the south of the country, in Kordofan, among a group called the Misriya, another Arab group that aren't part of the center. But so far, we haven't seen really extensive fighting in Al Ubaid a little bit between those groups. And I think a lot of people are hanging back to wait to see what happens in this war. And they probably suspect this will go to negotiations sooner rather than later. One of the reasons, perhaps, that it's continued even as long as it has is that both sides thus far have kept up enough financial resources to keep it going. But we have to consider this is a humanitarian crisis in terms of food getting into the country, in terms of the money supply. The Bank of Khartoum is shut down. People have widespread problems getting control of finances, getting control of food. But that also applies to the army, and that also applies to the RSF. And there's a question right now of what happens when their supply routes run out.
Well, then, in terms of supplies, that brings me back to something that you mentioned earlier, which has also been pretty prominent in Western reporting, the Wagner, Russia's mercenary group, being involved here. I mean, you've laid out that Hemeti went and met with Putin, and clearly that there's a relationship there. But what is the United States' and other Western powers' relationship with some of these groups in this conflict? Is that known? I mean, are there rumors about it?
So the great error, I think, that the international community made, in particular America, from the fall of Bashir in 2019 onwards, is that they consistently marginalized the major democratic force in the country, which were the resistance committees, these small, locally organized, non-hierarchical committees, but across the country, that really were the agent that led to the downfall of Bashir, and whose socioeconomic demands about what the state should be were not consonant with America's demands for debt relief, austerity, and the lifting of subsidies, and so they got marginalized. Instead, America basically thought, we have to play a role with these generals. Now, everyone's been on the phone with the generals. I mean, choose your mediation effort, choose your mediation partner. Is it Saudi? Is it the Emirates? Is it America? Is it Norway? Ultimately, they both have lines open to both men, but until there's a good reason for them to stop fighting, they're not going to do so. And I think both of them see an advantage in fighting right now. And one of the histories of Sudan is that negotiations aren't a break in fighting. They're a form of war themselves. They're a form of renegotiation. And war itself, you could also say, is a form of negotiation. In that, for instance, I think what SAF's trying to do is push the RSF into a weakened position in order to bring it to the negotiating table so that it accepts the Sudan Armed Forces dominance. Now, you asked about rumors. I think the most dangerous, the two most dangerous possibilities for the international community are, one, that it decides it wants a SAF victory, a Sudan Armed Forces victory, and it wants Hemeti marginalized. And I think that gives far too much power to what is basically a pretty weak army that is then nonetheless going to have to argue for a civilian transition. And the second thing that it can do that I think will be bad is to say, look, what is the problem? The problem is a war between these two belligerent parties. What is the solution? These two belligerent parties coming together and working out some sort of deal. That means ultimately that they both win. Because let's not forget, for 4 years, the war was between the civilians and the military. And now by having a military war between the two of them, effectively, they've
Civilians
become the only
boxed out.
Yeah, right. And this is going to be it's going to be a disaster also because ultimately these aren't strong military powers. They have no popular legitimacy. The Sudanese people want both of them to go. So whoever wins or whatever happens, ultimately they're going to be pushed back into the same civilian transition. And if what happens is that the agreement is one that reaffirms military power, then actually they go back into negotiations with the civilians weakened, despite the fact it's the two military powers that has destroyed the capital city.
Last question. From a really zoomed out perspective, how much has Western and you know, I don't know, you've mentioned other nations there like the EmMajorities and other very big financial players who are interested in resource extraction and privatization more broadly. How much has that been the source of general conflict and anti-democratic institutions where civilians are boxed out within Sudan for, I don't know, the past many decades?
I think that's a great question. I think the problem with the international approach is it's always looking for baddies, you know, like the Russians. Are the Russians the baddies? Well, yeah, the Russians have a relationship with Hemeti. They also have a relationship to the Sudan Armed Forces. This is a conflict which really emerges because almost inevitably, I think, Bashir built up these rival security services. What enabled that? I think your question is on point. What enabled that is the whole global structure of resource extraction. It's that Hemeti could have gold mines and all that gold gets sent directly to Dubai. The oil transit fees that they get from the oil from South Sudan that goes through Sudan to Port Sudan to be exported vanishes into bank accounts. It's the entire global architecture of resource extraction that has no real oversight, which benefits a whole bunch of different commodity traders, a whole bunch of different international firms. It's that which has enabled these rival military institutions to accumulate resources at the cost of the Sudanese people, immiserating the Sudanese people, which has enabled them to build up these war chests with which they're currently fighting this war.
Joshua Craze, researcher, writer, specializing in Sudan. Joshua, where can people find your work if they want to read more about this?
www.joshuacraze.com, or I just published a piece on Sudan with the New Left Review.
Simple enough. We'll put a link to that in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this. Joshua, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Great being on.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, with that, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920. We'll be taking your calls, reading your IMs. We have Brandon and Binder. Okay. While they're brought in, I will say on ESVN, we spoke at length about the results of the NFL draft, who won, who lost. We talked a lot about the hockey playoffs before something happened on Monday night. But the Winnipeg Jets head coach throwing his players under the bus publicly, you know, all of the Matthew Tkachuk, is he the MVP of the playoffs? And we spoke about Steph Curry, the NBA as well.
How old is Matthew Tkachuk?
He's 25 years old.
Was there an older person with that last name?
He has a brother, Brady Tkachuk. He has a brother.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, right. But
so I feel like I've been hearing that for a while.
He's he's one of the already becoming one of the best players in the league. So youtube.com/ESPN show. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning, we had Chris James, who the day after he was on Left Reckoning talking about his prank stylings, pranked Alex Jones by spoofing Tucker Carlson's number. And then he also had a Tucker Carlson AI.
Oh, that's amazing.
And apparently when you spoof somebody's number, so he knows Tucker Carlson's number. He called Alex Jones as Tucker Carlson's number. It comes up as Tucker, which is wild to me that phones, you can do that. But anyway, so yeah, you can check out me talking to Chris James about using like AI Gorka and AI Ben Shapiro to call into right-wingers shows, and as Gorka talk about how much his large head stretches out his shirts, and is Ben Shapiro
I
talking
remember
about how
that
he's
one.
too short to ride festival rides. So yeah, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We'll be talking with Kuba of This Is Revolution about some stuff this weekend. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
That is one of the only productive uses of AI. But hello, Binder and Brandon, who has a haircut. If people are
looking
watching
good.
and listening, and yeah.
Thank you.
good.
Yes. I was on vacation, had a little vacation haircut.
Oh, a little vacation haircut. That's
Feeling refreshed,
there you
revigorated.
go.
Invigorated?
Reinvigorated.
Reinvigorated.
You missed a
whatever.
syllable.
Yeah, it happens to me sometimes.
What's happening on the discourse, Brandon?
Well, I will be back from vacation this week. Hopefully my co-host will join me so we can talk about the Coinbase SEC lawsuit, the continued corruption coming out between Clarence Thomas and his sugar daddy, Harlan Crow, and the many other happenings in the news.
I saw David Roth on Twitter referred to their relationship as Harlan Crow treating Clarence Thomas like a Tamagotchi for 25 years and tending to him.
Harlan Crow is just a perfect name for a guy
I
that
know.
owns a Supreme Court justice too. Harlan Crow.
Harlan Crow.
What did he inherited some kind of
He's a real estate billionaire.
real estate business, right?
Naturally.
I kind of picture, I don't know if you remember in Fairly Odd Parents, they had like the cowboy who ran like the Dimmadome.
Yeah.
I picture Doug Dimmadome when I picture Harlan Crow, that kind of like Texas style, like,
Oh, he
25
definitely
gallon hat.
has a big hat like that, like
Man.
worn by some guy that, I don't know, killed a bunch of Native Americans in Texas and that he prominently displays, I'm sure.
Hitler's favorite cap.
No one does millennial references like Brandon.
No one does. You are the GOAT. Binder, what's happening over on Scam Economy and Doomed?
Had a dual episode of Scam Economy and Doomed where the shows crossed over. And I basically did a rundown of what's been going on with Elon Musk and Twitter over the past couple of weeks. Everything from the Twitter Blue disaster to his, his obvious turn to the subscription platform to basically send money to some of the worst people directly to some of the worst people on the internet. Check that out at youtube.com/Matt Binder. And it'll be going up as a podcast today at doomedcast.com and at scameconomy.com.
Why are you so afraid of his success, Matt? Why are you so afraid of his continued? Why are you so afraid to be dragged into the future by Elon Musk?
Right. I just don't appreciate a genius. His genius, I should say.
I guess not. Yeah. But he knows who you are. I mean, he's passive aggressively giving you that blue check.
It's coming out of his pocket personally.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes,
As opposed to him to saying someone, please just press a button, make Matt Binder a Twitter Blue subscriber.
Every week he has to write a check for it.
Yeah.
For his Matt Binder's Twitter
He
check.
did.
The little note section that says Matt Binder's to check mark.
He did tell, apparently, according to Ryan Mack of the New York Times, there was an email sent out to Twitter employees across the board directly from us telling them to please subscribe directly to any Twitter user who has that feature enabled, and they can expense it to the company. I believe that's called a Ponzi.
It's like user wash trading. He's like he's taking all the lessons from Dogecoin and like putting it into practice for like a platform of this size.
All right, guys. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube. He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss. I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous, you're a little bit upset, you're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1 half. 5 eighths. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabs.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
I think I might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
Throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Back.
We are back. We are back. It's the fun half, everybody. Turning off the voicemail. Again, the number is 646-257-3920. Jersey Mike writes in, Keith Kachuk was an NHL star who's the father of the Kachuk brothers. That's who you're thinking of, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. The bestest leftist. Can I get a plug for my friend Jen Ellis's book, Bernie's Mitten Maker? She used to make mittens out of recycled sweaters, and one day gave a pair to Bernie's aide when his hands were cold. He famously wore them on 2 occasions years apart, and her book is her experience in life as a teacher and LGBTQ advocate, and going viral twice. You should have her on as a guest. The story in which she dealt with her brief fame is heartwarming. All right, well, we'll write that down.
I mean, we all know the mittens. Bernie's mittens. Bernie's
Iconic.
Mitten Maker.
I mean, he should have gone to the Met Gala in those.
It's always funny when people are like, Bernie's actually wearing a $2,000 coat here. It's like,
I don't care.
first of all, he's worn it over like the course of like a few years, so you actually like average that out. He's getting a lot of use out of that. But like, how much? He's a senator.
Yeah.
Right. Those winter coats are expensive too.
I
Like,
know.
Even the cheap ones are expensive.
Like I haven't paid $1,000, but I have a what's the brand? The overly expensive brand, North Face. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a North Face one. That was like $400. It was like, it's
Yeah.
expensive, but I've had it for like
Barber-
4 years now.
Yeah, right.
Like barber jackets, like they're pretty expensive.
Yeah. I mean,
The Goose Down. What is the?
yeah, Canada Goose.
Yeah.
Everyone has those. I have a nice winter jacket apparently, but the reason I have it is that my sister accidentally took it home from a bar, and
Oh my God.
she went back to return it, and they were like, or maybe she didn't go back to return it. Maybe I should.
That makes the story better.
Yeah, but it was she's a little smaller than me, so I just took it, and that's
free
how
coat.
free coat, and it keeps me warm, honestly. But like that's a thing that happens all the time in the winter. There's never a place to put your coat at a bar at a lot of these bars, and they all are black, so they get mixed up.
Right.
Anyway, but it's
Whatever you need to tell yourself.
Good cover story. That was a good one.
Yeah. I'm just an accomplice. I'm not the
Stumbled
thief.
into a confession.
JR in Philly, everyone is a suburban cop and an MMA fighter all of a sudden, but they can't see that we have left the most helpless members of society to fend for themselves. I know. Yeah.
Where everyone's taking those alpha male training camp courses. So like that's all it teaches you how to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, ugh, doodles. I saw Hochul's statement this morning and was enraged, but oh my god, the video is